It's been many years, but I'm pleased to welcome back to the program C. Edmund Wright, who's a columnist for Breitbart, American Thinker, also author of WTF, How Karl Rove and the Establishment Lost Again. And that, what we talked about last time you were on, I mean, it sort of relates to what we're talking about today, which is Steve Bannon, Donald Trump, Breitbart. First, just very generally, what's your sense of Breitbart's relationship with Trump in the sort of post-Steve Bannon era?
Well, it's interesting. I was reading some comments today on the Breitbart forum, and there was an article, a very critical article of Donald Trump that was posted yesterday on Breitbart, called him Amnesty Don, in fact.
Right.
And I was reading the comments, and there's a lot of anti-Trump comments on there. There's a lot of pro-Trump comments still as well. A lot of people saying, "Hey, I trust Trump regardless," and then a lot of people calling him out for what appears to be a little bit of a cave on the amnesty issue, or maybe a big cave on the amnesty issue.
You had a blog post where you talked about how your relationship with Steve Bannon became sort of strained when your level of support for Trump, if I understood it correctly, was not up to the standards or demands that Steve Bannon had for what your support should be. Did I get that right? And can you sort of elaborate on that?
You kind of got it right, but not exactly. So I'd
Okay.
like to, clarify. My support of Trump was not up to what the Breitbart readers wanted,
Mm.
and I couldn't fake it, and I wouldn't fake it. My support wasn't up to what Bannon's was or what Matt Boyle's was. That said, they still, liked me as an anti-establishment writer. Being able to narrow in on the Republican Party establishment and their problems. But having in some sort of standoffish feelings about Trump was just not something anyone at Breitbart, as far as the readership, really wanted. So I just kind of backed away a little bit.
And what was keeping you from being as exuberant about Trump as maybe others wanted you to be?
Um, he's really not a conservative. I would have preferred more someone like Ted Cruz, who's more solid conservative, or maybe
Wow.
even Scott Walker, who had shown some success fighting the liberal establishment in Wisconsin.
Mm.
Um, so Trump was not my favorite, nor was he at the bottom of the list. I certainly preferred him over Jeb Bush, for example, over John Kasich, for example. Um, and quite frankly, Trump has governed a lot more conservatively than he campaigned. He's governed a lot more conservatively than he's talked, for the last 30 or 40 years.
That's
That
interesting. So
became,
let me go back just a couple sentences. So you preferred Trump over Jeb Bush, for example. On policy, what policy of Trump's did you like better than Jeb Bush's as a conservative, again?
first of all, it wasn't really on policy per se.
Oh,
Um, yeah, Jeb is a moderate. He's a typical Republican establishment moderate.
yep.
And keep in mind, a lot of Trump supporters think Trump ended Jeb Bush. That's not really true. Jeb was never going anywhere. The only people who thought Jeb Bush for president in 2016 was a good idea, were like 20 commentators in Washington, D.C.
Hmm.
No one outside that. There's more of an aversion for family political dynasties, and the Bushes pushed it with having two of them. There was no way the Republican primary electorate was going to put a third Bush up there. But Jeb Bush he's not confrontational enough. In fact, in 2011, I wrote an article where I said Trump's willingness to confront would actually be a very valuable lesson for the Republican Party. I
That's
never thought he'd
interesting.
actually
So
try to
if I'm
dominate.
understanding you correctly, it wasn't that Trump's policy appealed to you, because like you said, you're a conservative and Trump's not really a conservative. It wasn't his policy that appealed to you more than Jeb Bush. It was that he would confront other people.
Right. He would fight. And
Huh.
again, it just goes back. And I wrote something back in 2011 I called Translating Trump. And it was
Yeah.
based on an interview with the Rush Limbaugh show, where Trump went hard after Obama, went hard after the Democrats. And I thought, okay, this is what we need to do. Mitt Romney would not do that. Jeb Bush certainly wouldn't do that. So what I would have, my perfect candidate would have been Donald Trump's attitude, maybe toned down 20%, and maybe Ted Cruz's philosophy.
Wow. Now that's something to that's the stuff of dreams or nightmares, I guess, depending on which side of the aisle you're on.
My
What
dream, your nightmare, right?
what do you see as the future of Breitbart now that there has been sort of a split, but at the same time, a lot of the Breitbart readership seems like the Breitbart readership is in a sense confused or maybe split significantly because of what's taken place with Bannon, Breitbart, and Trump. What do you think the future of Breitbart will be as a publication and what's left of Trump's presidency?
Well, yeah, boy, that's a tough one. I guess if I could answer that, I could go to Alexander Marlowe and say, "Look, I'm worth a bunch of money to you."
Hmm.
Um, I think a lot of it's going to depend on how Trump's presidency unfolds. It'll be very interesting, for example, to see how this latest thing with DACA and the Dreamers and maybe path to citizenship and maybe not unfolds. There was kind of a assumption during the primary by a lot of hardcore pro-Trump early adopting voters that he was the most hardcore, the most consistently hardcore on issues like deportation, what have you. And that was really never the case. He was all over the board on that issue.
Sure.
He was pretty firm on the border. So I think it'll be interesting to see how the reality of Trump unfolds versus maybe the projection of Trump that I think a lot of the hardcore voters, really bought into.
Yeah, you mentioned DACA. I mean, I'm curious, how do you think Trump handled the recent, I don't even know what to call it, situation around DACA and negotiations on the government shutdown?
Well, Trump, I think there's competing forces inside Trump, and I don't mean that to be negative necessarily. I think on the one hand, you have the Stephen Miller hard line tie to his hardest core base.
Hmm.
And then on the other hand, you have a guy who, he doesn't really, when you get right down to it, unless you've personally offended him, he doesn't want to upset you. So, and he likes to make a deal. So I think there's going to be some tension within not only the Trump administration, but maybe in Trump's heart and mind as well, where he goes with this.
Did you get the sense, like I did, that Trump was almost like confused as to why there even was a shutdown, in the sense that, he had put out a couple different ways that he thought it could be averted. He said, hey, get me a clean DACA bill. And I'd be willing to do that, but then that sort of evaporated. At another point, he said, if I get anything bipartisan on paper, I'll sign it, but then he didn't do that. Like, I was getting the sense that he almost was kind of confused as to why there even was a shutdown.
I don't know about confused. I think there's a lot of confusion about shutdowns in Washington and across 350 million people.
Hmm.
Yeah, I come from the conservative wing of the party that, hey, a shutdown's not a bad thing necessarily. I also think that when you go back and look at what's called the Ted Cruz shutdown in 2013, all the Republicans were complaining that was going to kill them in the 2014 midterms.
Yeah.
Actually, it came back to be a net positive in that.
How do you
So
figure?
all of that is the politics of a shutdown are very confusing. I would only say that Trump never claimed to be an expert on the civics of how our government ran. That was part of his appeal to a lot of people. So I would just maybe chalk it up to some of that. He just wants to get things done, and I think the movement of Washington frustrates him.
Who do you think is to blame for this most recent shutdown?
Well, again, I might say credit instead of blame. Um, you know, I think Chuck Schumer sort of played the part this time that Ted Cruz played in 2013 without the filibuster.
Huh.
But what I think is interesting is you and I may never agree on who's to blame per se, but the Republicans are not losing this in a PR standpoint nearly to the extent they generally have in the past.
Well, I'm a little. I'm not. You and I might not agree, but I'm not sure you're agreeing with what you've said in the past. Because when we interviewed you back in October of 2013, you talked about the shutdown, and you said, as far as that shutdown, you said, "quote Obviously, I think with the Democrats controlling the White House and the Senate, it obviously can't be a Republican shutdown." So by that same standard that you sort of gave me in October of 2013, this can't be Schumer's fault, right?
Yes and no.
Oh.
The problem is,
Huh.
if you get into the nuts and bolts of who caused the shutdown and you have to go through arcane Senate rules,
Right.
that's one thing. Who is at fault is it ultimately who gets the blame for it, rightly or wrongly. I have just kind of, accepted that the truth of who's really at the bottom of a shutdown is never going to be important. Only thing that's important is what the perception is.
On that, actually, we agree. Surprisingly, I've said before that I believe that these shutdowns, particularly because most elements of the government actually do keep running, I believe that it's a political football that you can either benefit from or be hurt by. I question how much people actually vote based on their perception of who is to blame for a shutdown. But I actually believe that it's effectively almost 100% a perception issue. And it sounds like you agree.
Yeah, I do agree with that. And I think there's other variables too. I think most Republican voters agreed with Ted Cruz on his stance on Obamacare, and that's why eventually it helped the Republicans. I'm not sure the Democrats want to go that far for DACA
Mm.
the way Schumer did. I mean, I guess we'll see in the 2018 primaries and then into the 2018 general midterms.
When it comes to those midterms, what do you see as the voting issues that will determine not only how people vote, but the level of enthusiasm and what turnout will be? Because in these midterms, traditionally, the party that holds the White House loses seats in the House and or Senate. It didn't happen in 2002 for George W. Bush, and I think we have being in a very recently post 9/11 moment to sort of look at as to why that was sort of an outlier. But what do you think will sort of dictate how the 2018 midterms go?
Boy, a lot there. I'd like to comment real quickly. First, the 2002 midterms were probably directly a result of the Paul Wellstone Memorial when Tom Harkin hijacked that thing and it became an embarrassment. That was just enough to move the needle, is my theory. I think right now it's way too early to judge the 2018 midterms.
Really?
I think this latest government shutdown thing, kind of being pinned on as the Schumer shutdown, seemed to move the needle on the generic congressional ballot. But I think 9 months from now, the biggest thing the Republicans have going for them is 9 months of increased take-home pay as a result of tax reform. That's where they're going to hang their hat to counter the dynamic you mentioned, which is true. Normally, the first midterm after a new president is a reaction to that.
Well, what about an issue like I had a caller recently who was a big Trump supporter who said, for me, the wall is the issue. And he initially said, if there's no progress on that wall by 2020, I might not vote for re-election for Donald Trump. Is that an issue which at this point seems almost laughable that we're going to have a Mexican paid for wall in progress by 9 months from now? Do you think that will be a voting issue for Republicans?
Not so much in 2018 because Trump's not on the ballot and nobody is tied to the issue of the wall the way Trump is.
Yeah.
Just like that. But yes, I mean, I think Trump could definitely lose some support over the wall if there's not some sort of progress made on it, or at least the perception of progress.
Now, speaking very candidly with me, Edmund, as you said, you are a conservative. Trump is not a conservative, and that was the source of some of your hesitations in terms of your support for Trump. When you hear Trump during the campaign say something like, I'm going to build a wall and Mexico is going to pay for it, aside from whether you like that idea or dislike that idea, do you believe that Trump truly thinks that's something he's going to do, or do you recognize it as relatively far-fetched?
I think it's far-fetched, but I do think that he's very insistent on securing the border, whatever combination of wall, fence, virtual fence, drone, or maybe patrol boats on Falcon Lake, for example. It's a long, complex border geographically. I think he's very serious about securing the border. I think the wall just kind of became a shorthand version for that. I do think a lot of people bought into it more literally than maybe Trump ever meant, and I think he played to that at the rallies. But I think Trump understands that the wall is going to be a combination of different things just from a logistical, practical standpoint.
Now, from a national security standpoint, of course, the reality is that most people who are here in the U.S. Under what we would call illegal circumstances did not physically cross the U.S.-Mexico border, right? So do you think Trump knows that? And more importantly, do you think he cares? Because it's much less appealing to talk about, we will target visa overstayers. That doesn't have the same cachet as talking about building a wall.
Yeah. Okay. Again, you get down to what the reality of our politics, David, is that
yes,
perception often trumps reality.
Right.
Again, I think Trump has a vision for a secure border and a sovereign state. I don't think he's that interested in the details of how he gets there. And
I
again,
agree.
that's not a negative or a positive comment. That's just kind of the way he's always managed. He's always been the big picture guy,
Yeah.
and he's always had people do the details. And with the exception of trade, where I think maybe he gets a little too involved, I think that's the way he's going to run the border security situation and immigration as well.
Who could have predicted that the election of Donald Trump would have me seeing eye to eye with you, Edmund? Just 5 years after we had basically no agreements whatsoever in our first interview. It's really quite a unique experience, the world of Trump, isn't it?
Yeah, the Trump movement, and I separate Trump from the Trump movement. I actually have a lot more problems with some of the Trump hardcore supporters than I ever did or ever do with Donald Trump himself.
Attaboy.
Uh, the Trump movement divided the Republican Party not just in base versus establishment, which is a little nuance that Rush Limbaugh hadn't figured out yet. It also divided the base into two parties. It really cut the Republican, conservative, libertarian, non-democrat base, if you will, whatever that universe is.
Yep.
It really cut it into four pieces, and we have a lot of confusing cross currents as a result.
Well, at least he's pro-life, right? As of being 69 years old, he became pro-life, and that actually, I think, did carry a lot of weight with some important groups that helped elect him.
I would agree with that. I think they were perhaps remarkably uncurious about some other things, but yes, I would agree with your assessment of that. And he came down kind of where I wanted him to come down, so I understand what you're saying. I'm just not going to complain about that per se.
All right, C. Edmund Wright, columnist for Breitbart and for American Thinker. Great to catch up with you after all these years.
All right, David, let's do it again.